The night of June 5, 1944, stretched cold and silent over southern England, the kind of silence that only exists before history changes direction. Along darkened runways, hundreds of transport aircraft stood ready, their metal bodies glistening faintly under shaded floodlights. Mechanics moved quickly but spoke little. Officers checked manifests with tight expressions. Everywhere there was motion, yet beneath it all lay a heavy stillness, as if every man present understood that the hours ahead would decide the fate of the war in Western Europe. Inside the waiting C-47 Skytrains sat thousands of American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Their faces were marked with camouflage, their uniforms weighed down by nearly 70 pounds of equipment. Rifles hung ready across their chests. Grenades, ammunition, medical kits, rations, and folding and trenching tools were strapped wherever space allowed. Some men carried extra machine gun belts draped over their shoulders like bandoliers. Others tucked photographs into inner pockets. Wives, parents, children, silent reminders of a world far removed from what awaited them across the channel. Few spoke now. The jokes and forced laughter from earlier in the evening had faded. Training had prepared them for this moment, yet no training could fully erase the awareness that many would not return. This was Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted, and these airborne soldiers were its opening gamble. Their mission was clear: land behind the beaches of Normandy hours before the seaborne assault, seize bridges, capture crossroads, destroy artillery batteries, and scatter German defenses so thoroughly that the enemy would be unable to mount an organized counterattack. Success would open the road into occupied France. Failure could trap Allied troops on the beaches under devastating fire. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had accepted the risk because surprise demanded it. Just before midnight, engines roared alive one after another, the vibration rolling across the airfields like distant thunder. Red and green signal lamps flickered. Then the first aircraft began to move, taxiing into the darkness before lifting heavily into the night sky. Soon, long formations of transports stretched across the clouds, carrying nearly 13,000 paratroopers toward enemy territory. Inside the aircraft, red jump lights bathed the soldiers in a dim, almost unreal glow. The drone of engines was so loud that conversation became impossible. Each man retreated into his own thoughts. Lieutenant Richard Winters sat quietly among his platoon, his expression calm, his mind focused on the tasks ahead. Leadership in airborne units demanded a particular kind of composure, fear acknowledged but controlled, uncertainty replaced with discipline. As the planes crossed the English Channel, weather conditions deteriorated. Thick cloud banks swallowed entire formations, forcing pilots to rely on instruments while struggling to maintain spacing. Violent turbulence struck without warning, tossing the aircraft and testing the nerves of even the most experienced crews. Then, suddenly, the darkness below erupted. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, sending black bursts of flak into the sky. Orange flashes illuminated the wings. Aircraft jolted as shrapnel tore through metal skin. Pilots veered instinctively to avoid the explosions, but every evasive maneuver disrupted the carefully planned flight paths. Formations fragmented, timing slipped, navigation beacons were missed. What had been choreographed with precision on briefing room maps began unraveling in the chaos of combat. Inside the fuselage, the red light switched to green. The jumpmasters shouted the command, their voices barely audible above the engines. One by one, paratroopers stepped into the void. The night swallowed them instantly. But the drop was already going wrong. High winds scattered the descending soldiers across miles of countryside. Some drifted far from their designated zones, others landed directly among German positions.
In low-lying areas deliberately flooded by German engineers, several paratroopers plunged into dark water, the crushing weight of their equipment pulling them under before they could cut themselves free. Weapons were lost, radios vanished into marshland. Officers hit the ground alone, separated from their units within seconds. For a brief, terrible moment, it appeared the operation had collapsed before it truly began. Yet, airborne doctrine anticipated chaos. Every paratrooper carried the same instruction: if you cannot find your unit, accomplish the mission anyway. Small groups began forming almost immediately. 3 men here, 5 there, sometimes led by a sergeant, sometimes by whoever demonstrated the clearest head. Rank mattered less now than initiative. Training took control where planning no longer could. Near the town of Saint-Mère-Église, Private John Steele descended helplessly toward a village already alive with alarm. Fires burned below, casting flickering light across stone buildings. As he drifted downward, his parachute snagged on the church steeple, leaving him suspended high above the square. German soldiers moved beneath him, their voices echoing upward. Steele remained perfectly still, pretending to be dead, listening to gunfire crack through the night. Around him, the invasion had begun. Across hedgerow-lined fields, those thick earthen walls that divided Norman farmland into a natural labyrinth, scattered paratroopers oriented themselves as best they could. Some navigated by compass, others by memory of aerial photographs studied weeks earlier. Everywhere the same realization emerged: they were far from where they were supposed to be. Yet, something unexpected followed that realization: opportunity. German commanders, receiving fragmented reports, struggled to determine the scale of the airborne assault. Was this the main invasion? A diversion? The uncertainty forced hesitation, and hesitation was precisely what the Allies needed. On a narrow causeway leading inland from Utah Beach, fewer than 20 paratroopers gathered in darkness. Intelligence had warned that German armor might use these elevated roads to counterattack the landing forces at dawn. The Americans possessed no artillery, no vehicles, barely any communications equipment. What they did have were explosives and determination. Moving quickly, they rigged demolition charges beneath the road and established firing positions along the hedgerows. Hours later, the distant growl of engines signaled approaching vehicles. When the Germans entered the kill zone, the night erupted with detonations and rifle fire. The road was shattered, the advance stalled. A counterattack that might have reached the beaches in critical early hours instead dissolved into confusion. Elsewhere, Lieutenant Winters and a handful of paratroopers located a German artillery battery positioned to fire directly onto Utah Beach. If those guns opened up, soldiers pouring from landing craft would face slaughter before even clearing the sand. Though heavily outnumbered, Winters organized a swift assault. Machine guns laid suppressive fire while small teams flanked the trenches. Grenades exploded in tight bursts. One position after another fell silent. Within minutes, the battery was neutralized, an action later studied in military academies as a model of small unit tactics under pressure. All across Normandy, similar engagements unfolded. Small bands of Americans cut telephone lines, sabotaged rail lines, ambushed patrols, and seized crossroads. Their numbers were unclear even to themselves, yet to German officers the effect was magnified. Reports flooded headquarters describing enemy activity everywhere. Some believed an entire airborne army had landed deep behind the lines. Others suspected elaborate deception. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had long argued that the invasion must be crushed at the shoreline before Allied strength could build. Rapid armored response was essential, but speed depended on clarity, and clarity had vanished into the Norman night. Orders were delayed as commanders struggled to interpret conflicting intelligence. By the time the scale of the seaborne landings became undeniable, precious hours had already slipped away. Dawn revealed parachutes hanging from trees, draped across rooftops, tangled in pastures. The drop had been chaotic, disastrously so by traditional standards, yet that very chaos had become a weapon. Instead of confronting concentrated airborne divisions, German units encountered resistance in every direction. Every hedgerow suggested ambush. Every crossroad appeared defended. The scattered paratroopers were unpredictable, impossible to encircle, impossible to categorize. A German officer would later describe them with frustration. They were everywhere. For the men themselves, however, the experience was far simpler and far harsher. They fought without knowing whether the invasion had succeeded, without assurance that reinforcements were coming, without even a clear sense of where friendly lines existed. Exhaustion crept in, ammunition ran low, and still they held their ground. Because their task was not to win the war in a single night, it was to delay, disrupt.
Dawn spread slowly across Normandy, pale light filtering through low clouds as if the sky itself were reluctant to reveal what the night had created. The countryside, peaceful only hours earlier, now carried the unmistakable marks of invasion. Parachutes hung silently from orchard trees, their white silk stirring in the early morning breeze. Equipment containers lay smashed in open fields. Smoke drifted upward from isolated firefights, still echoing across the hedgerows. And scattered throughout this awakening landscape were American paratroopers, tired, disoriented, often alone, yet already reshaping the battlefield in ways few German commanders fully understood. For many of these soldiers, the first sight of daylight brought a sobering realization. They were deeper behind enemy lines than expected. Church bells rang in some villages, alarms in others. French civilians peered cautiously from shuttered windows, uncertain whether the figures moving through their fields were liberators or simply another passing army. Communication remained fractured. Radios had been lost in marshes or destroyed on impact. Signal lamps were useless in daylight. Officers relied on runners, hand signals, and instinct. Yet despite the confusion, momentum began to build. Small groups merged into larger ones. Junior leaders emerged naturally, their authority accepted without question because survival demanded it. The airborne divisions had not landed as planned, but they had landed with purpose, and purpose was proving stronger than disorder. Near Sainte-Mère-Église, one of the first towns to witness the drop, American troops pushed cautiously into the streets. The village held immense strategic value. Controlling it meant controlling routes that German forces might use to reinforce Utah Beach. Sporadic gunfire cracked between stone buildings as paratroopers advanced from doorway to doorway. German defenders, surprised by the sudden presence of enemy soldiers inside what they believed was secure territory, resisted fiercely but struggled to organize a coordinated defense. By mid-morning, the town was effectively in American hands, marking one of the earliest significant objectives secured on D-Day. It was more than a tactical victory. It was psychological proof that the invasion had penetrated inland. Meanwhile, German headquarters wrestled with a fog of contradictory intelligence. Some reports insisted the landings in Normandy were merely a diversion, the true invasion expected near Pas-de-Calais. Others warned that the scale unfolding before them could not be a feint. The Allied deception campaign, carefully constructed over months, was still doing its work. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and phantom armies had planted deep uncertainty within German strategic thinking. That uncertainty now slowed decisions at the very moment speed was most critical. Panzer divisions, the armored fist capable of driving the Allies back into the sea, waited for authorization that did not immediately come. Adolf Hitler himself, convinced that Normandy might not be the main effort, hesitated to release reserves. Those lost hours would become some of the most consequential of the war. Out in the patchwork fields, the paratroopers sensed none of this high-level paralysis. Their world had narrowed to immediate dangers, the next hedgerow, the next bend in the road, the next burst of gunfire.
The Norman bocage transformed every field into a natural fortress. Thick earthen banks, topped with dense vegetation, blocked visibility and movement alike. A soldier could stand only yards away and remain unseen. For defenders, it was ideal terrain. For attackers, it was a maze that demanded patience and nerve. Yet the airborne troops adapted quickly. Rather than advancing in rigid formations, they moved with stealth, probing for weak points, slipping through gaps, striking suddenly before disappearing again. German patrols found themselves harassed from unexpected directions. Convoys slowed, wary of ambush. Every delay rippled outward, complicating the broader defensive effort. On one rural approach road, a column of German vehicles attempted to move toward the beaches after receiving fragmented orders to counterattack. They never arrived on schedule. A handful of paratroopers, supported by a hastily positioned machine gun, opened fire from concealed positions, forcing the convoy to deploy and return fire. What followed was less a battle than a prolonged disruption, exactly the kind airborne planners had envisioned. Minutes became hours. By the time the Germans disengaged and sought alternate routes, the tempo of the invasion had already shifted beyond their control. Acts of initiative multiplied across the region. Engineers improvised demolitions, using whatever explosives they could gather. Medics established aid stations inside farmhouses, working tirelessly as wounded men were carried in on makeshift stretchers fashioned from doors or fence rails. Chaplains moved quietly among the troops, offering brief prayers over those who would not rise again. War compressed time. Moments of terror were followed by stretches of tense waiting, broken suddenly by violence. And always there remained the uncertainty. Were the beach landings holding? Had the Armada survived the crossing? No one inland could yet be sure. By late morning, distant thunder rolled faintly from the direction of the coast. Naval guns. The sound carried reassurance. The invasion fleet was there. The battle for the beaches was underway. German officers, piecing together the scale of events, began to grasp a troubling pattern. The airborne landings were not isolated raids, they were interlocking obstacles designed to fracture movement and communication. Bridges destroyed here meant armor delayed there. A captured crossroads forced units onto longer, more vulnerable routes. Cut telephone lines compelled reliance on radio transmissions, already strained by overload. Field Marshal Rommel, returning hurriedly from Germany upon learning of the invasion, would later remark on the decisive importance of those first hours. The war, he believed, could be won or lost on the beaches, yet the beaches could not be defended properly if chaos reigned behind them, and chaos was precisely what the paratroopers had delivered. Still, the cost was real. Many airborne units had suffered heavy casualties during the drop. Others fought on with dwindling ammunition, uncertain when resupply might reach them. But resilience defined their effort. Whenever groups encountered one another, the same brief exchanges repeated. Who's in charge? What's the mission? Then they moved out again. Leadership flowed not merely from rank, but from clarity of action. Courage proved contagious. Even as German resistance stiffened in places, the psychological balance had begun to tilt. Surprise, once the defenders' ally, now favored the attackers. By afternoon, clearer reports filtered through the Allied chain of command. Utah Beach, despite early navigational errors, was firmly in American hands, with fewer casualties than feared. The airborne troops had played a decisive role, blocking approaches and sowing confusion at precisely the right moment. What had appeared overnight as a disastrous dispersion was revealing itself as an operational success of remarkable depth. The battlefield was still young, the outcome far from settled, yet an irreversible process had begun. Europe's long-awaited liberation had found its foothold. And as the sun climbed higher over Normandy, illuminating soldiers pressing forward through fields that only yesterday knew nothing of war, one conclusion quietly took shape. The scattered descent of the airborne had not weakened the invasion, it had strengthened it. Germany had prepared to repel a concentrated blow. Instead, it faced a storm without a single center, a force defined by initiative rather than rigid design. The lost paratroopers were lost no longer. They had become the sharp edge of a turning tide.